Hello everyone out there in YouTube land. This is the second Rubik's Cube hidden chess table that I made. This video is going to demonstrate how it works, and I'm going to take it apart and show the internals. So just to clarify, this is the version or Mark II. This is the first one I built. So there's a video on this one already that shows the disassembly of this one if you want to see that. And yeah, so externally they're very similar. Same dimensions, same basic construction. The patterns are different, obviously. Both of them are actual patterns. I just took a Rubik's Cube and shuffled it up until I found a pattern that I liked, so it is actually, correct. So just as a recap, I'll show how the first table functions. So on this one, you turn the top clockwise, and as you do, there's two drawers, one on each opposing end, that will open. And then when you get to the last, 10 degrees of travel, it will push open the lid, and there's this little arm in here that pushes the lid open. And you can then open the top. Pretty straightforward. So this table, in order to open the top, you can see the mechanism there working. You have to rotate the table 100 degrees or 180 degrees, and there's no way to open the top without opening the drawers, and vice versa. Yeah. So with the second table, I wanted to make it more of like a hidden chest, because this one it is sort of a hidden chest, but as soon as you turn it, it becomes obvious that there's drawers and whatnot. So with this one, if you turn the top, nothing happens. You can turn it clockwise, you can turn it counterclockwise. And where that table only turns 180 degrees and then stops, this one has infinite motion. I could spin this all day and it's not going to do anything. So this one, to open the top, you actually press this square in. That kicks the top up a bit and you can lift it. And opens similar to the other one, same hinge mechanism or same style of hinge mechanism. So the opening mechanism is pretty straightforward here. Just like a little arm to push the door open. Gives it that little kick. This is difficult to see from the outside. I deliberately tried to make it obscure and hidden. As you can see, there's little rails that extend past the edge, so that when you're looking in, it blocks the view. So you can't tell that this square, or it's harder to tell that this square is different. The only obvious sign is this small gap. I couldn't eliminate it completely, obviously, but other than that, it looks like the other squares. Once the top is open, you can see this inconspicuous part in the center with this lever here. So this lever, what it does is, so when it's the way it is, you can spin the top, nothing happens. However, if I flip this lever to this side, now when I open the top, the drawers open. Same as the other table, clockwise open the drawers, counterclockwise closes the drawers. And you'll notice that I can continue, so it still takes about 180 degrees of travel to open the drawers completely, but once they open, I can continue to spin this clockwise. I can spin it as much as I want. There is a bit more resistance once the drawers are open, so you can see as they're opening, it doesn't take much force to turn, but then when it reaches the end, it kind of stiffens up a little bit. You can still spin it, but it's harder. Same thing when it closes, so once they're closed, you can keep spinning it. It takes a bit more force, but it still works. And again, flip this lever back, and they do nothing. So now I'm going to do some disassembly and show you guys how this actually works. So you'll see that there's this big nut in the center with a piece of wire going through it. This is sort of what holds the whole thing together, so as long as that's there, I can't lift the top off of the base, it holds it in place. So first thing we have to do to take this apart is remove this nut. I do that by bending the wire straight. This nut isn't really tight, and you'll see why after. So we take that off. Now the whole top can lift off of the base. I'm gonna set the camera down while I do this. So once the top is removed, we are left with this stuff here, and this is what makes the drawer mechanism work. So this is basically a clutch. Well, it is a clutch. This is just a spacer. This is a spring to take up some slack. This is one half of the clutch, part with a piece of bicycle tire on it. And notice there's two rods that stick out of it. So these are keyed with the top portion of the chest. So when the top spins, this also spins. I can actually show you how it fits in here. So this just fits in here like that. So as long as the top spins, this spins. And the reason it's just held on with these rods is so that if I remove the top, I can set it down flat and it doesn't have this basically sticking out the bottom. Makes it easier to store and take apart. It just makes it easier to work with that way. So this part is one half of the clutch. The other half is this disc here, basically. And this is what operates the drawers. So if I turn this clockwise, the drawers open. If I turn it counterclockwise, they close. So what causes this clutch to engage and disengage, you might wonder? So this lever inside the chest, you'll notice there's this ridge here, right? And as I turn this, you'll see that this side is lower, or it's closer to this surface than this side is. So this is essentially a cam track. So what happens is, this would be the drawer actuation side, I'll say. So this side would move the drawers, this side would not. So when I turn this, it's pushing a cam, or it's basically pushing this roller bearing, which is attached to this lever. So this lever can move. It's spring loaded. That's just so that when I lift the top off, it doesn't just dangle. And well, for the same reason that that piece is separate. So when I lift the top off, it doesn't flop down and then make it harder to handle, basically. So actually, I will move the lever. I'll do it with my other arm here. And you can see that that moves that piece in and out. So moving the lever inside the cube moves this arm. And this arm, this is where the nut runs through, or the main shaft runs through. This space here is where this spacer sits. So when this moves, it pushes this spacer in, which forces this spring into this clutch piece. And this is a very stiff spring. This is a valve spring from a cylinder head of a car. The only reason this is here is so that I can basically put some preload into the system. I could use, I guess in theory you could use a solid spacer, but it would be difficult to get the right amount of pressure. It'd have to be, your stock head would have to be basically exact. So with this spring, it gives you some allowance. And yeah, so turn the lever inside the cube. That pushes the second lever on the bottom of the top. That pushes on the spacer, which pushes on the spring, which pushes on this clutch piece, which forces this clutch piece into the disc. So if I just spin it here, it's not going to do anything. But if I press it down and turn, it's hard to do. It will turn the drawers. There is a small spring in here. That's just to keep this part off of the clutch disc, basically, so it's not constantly rubbing. So you can see it doesn't take very much force to push it down. That's just there so it's not rubbing all the time. So when it's in this state, you can also see these four bearings. That's what the top of the chest rides on as it spins. There's a groove cut in the bottom of that, our big ring. Saw it earlier. So that's what these bearings run in. They are adjustable for height. That's what these little levers are. So it's kind of a weak point of this design, honestly. These move far too easily. These screws, in theory, should lock them. they pivot on this screw, and this screw's locked, so the whole thing can kind of do like this. But this doesn't really have enough force. In retrospect, I should have put like a stop plate under with another screw pushing up against it, and then you could use that screw to, you know, unwind it a bit to lift it higher and screw it in to bring it down. That would be far more sturdy. I might actually change that in the future. But anyways, that's how this works. That's why it spins so freely. On the first one, I just use a big plastic bushing, which works fine. It's very sturdy. Like, you could sit on the top of that one and it's not gonna scratch this part because they're physically separated by a plastic shim. This one, if you sat on it, these ball bearings would probably, or the bearing races here would probably dig into the MDF base, and it would most likely rub, so that's kind of one disadvantage of this design, but it does spin freely, which is what I was aiming for. This whole plate too, you can see it's held on with these 4 screws. The holes that these go through are much larger, that's why they have these fender washers. That's so when I was making it, I can like adjust this to get the alignment correct. And then once I got it correct, there's one nail here, one nail here. I drilled a very small hole that's, well, just the size of that nail. And these are basically locating dowels so that I can get it back in the exact same spot if I have to take it apart and don't have to worry about alignment. Okay, so now I will take this part off and we will see how the drawer mechanism works. Okay, once you remove that part, we have a bit better view of what's going on in here. So, when I turn this clockwise, the drawer is open, obviously. This part and this part interact together to act as a stop, as the open stop, so that can't rotate past that point. That limits the travel of the drawers. What limits the closed travel is the contact between the 2 arms, basically. They touch when they're at full close. So these arms are connected to this main shaft by a piece. It's hard to see because it's sort of hidden underneath this bolt and this bolt. You can see part of it there. So as I turn this, you can see it turns. So these arms connect the central shaft to the drawers. And like the other chests, they're sort of an odd shape. They're like a sort of a U shape, so they can fit around the mechanism. Because when they're closed, so once bolted basically there to there, so it has to be this weird kind of, I guess, an L-shaped piece in order to fit around the mechanism. So one of the other features of this table is that the drawers cannot be opened. Basically, if they're locked, which, you can hear that snap, that's the drawers locking. So if they're locked, they cannot be opened without turning the top. So I can pull on this. Actually, I'll push from the inside. And it'll open a bit, but it won't open any further than that. You can't actually open it unless this is unlocked. Now they open. Actually, from here you can see that mechanism a bit better. So the way the locking mechanism works is that there are additional levers on the drawers. The arms connect to the drawers. They don't actually connect straight to the drawers. They connect via this bolt to this other arm, which attaches to the drawer. And this is basically a lever with a spring on one end. So you can see what happens is that when it reaches the end, it gives the drawer a bit of spring. So that's how this manages to lock, because basically what it's doing is when it's closing, So these arms are all the way pulled in basically. The drawers are tight, so the drawers are closed to the base of the body, but those springs allow it to go a little bit past, and it's subtle, but you can see that the springs allow those arms to be pulled just a little bit further and then snap in a locking position. And the reason it's locked is because if you look at the axis of rotation here, so the axis of rotation is here, and the arm connects here and here. So if we were to draw a line through those bolts, that line would be on this side of this axis. So any time or any force you're trying to push on this drawer, it's basically trying to pull on this side, which means it's trying to rotate this counterclockwise, which is the locked position. Whereas if I turn it slightly, now the bolt is on this side and here. So if I try to pull on the drawer, it's trying to pull on this side of the shaft, which is basically the same as trying to like turn it clockwise. That's why it opens. So again, when it's here, push, it doesn't want to turn, and as soon as it gets past that mark, it allows it to open. So that's just another feature. I wanted the drawers to be nice and snug when they were closed, just to make it, you know, more hidden chest-like. So that pretty much covers the mechanics or the operation of this, how it functions. I'll now put it back together. Putting this back together is a bit of a pain because you have to get that part lined up perfectly with those two holes. It's kind of difficult to do, so I'll try to do that now. There we go, it wasn't too hard. So that nut is necessary. Without it, if I try to activate this, it just wants to lift the whole top from the bottom instead of compressing that spring. So the nut is necessary. Put that back together now. I did mark this nut so I know where to put it back. It is important that it has the right, roughly the right amount of torque. If there's not enough, then it'd be a bit sloppy here. So right now there's a little bit of slop, like I can lift it a bit, but not very much. And if it's too tight, then it gets a little stiff to turn. I'll briefly mention the hinges too, because they are a point of improvement over the last box. So the first one uses a very similar hinge mechanism. Main difference, this one I used plywood that was too thin, so I don't have as much meat to screw into. And also I used screws, wood screws, instead of bolts. On this one, I wisened up and I used small bolts, like M8 bolts or something. They're just threaded right into the wood. You can actually get a quite good thread just by drilling a hole that's slightly undersized and just forcing the bolt in there with like an impact driver or something, and get good threads that way. At least in plywood. In regular wood it might split, but in plywood it works pretty good. And the bolts are much stouter than screws. Screws are too flimsy, so this one it kind of wobbles a bit. Also the screws tend to back themselves out, which is annoying, because then the drawer, or then the top gets more sloppy. Like this one's got a bit of slack in it. It still works, but you know, it's not great. This one also has one spring in the middle. This one I went to 2 springs, one on each hinge, which I think looks a little nicer, works a bit better too. And finally, on this one, I had to round this edge quite a lot, and also this edge. You can see this is sort of tapered a little bit. That's because these hinges are made in a way so that it sort of lifts the top up and then open, sort of. But on this one it wasn't aggressive enough, so it would still catch on that edge slightly. So on this one, I tapered this at a 45, and also this at a 45. That way it pretty much eliminates that problem, and it doesn't bind when you try to open it. By the way, the whole point of this sort of weird hinge mechanism, which is like a 4-bar link, is just so that I can have a concealed hinge. Otherwise I would have had to have the hinge like on the outside. There'd be like a big pin here or something where it would, you know, leave her open, which would look kind of stupid. So this way you can have the hinge hidden, and you can see when it opens it actually lifts up and over that lip. So that's the purpose of these hinges. This is basically copied from like the trunk hinges of a car, pretty much operate in the exact same way. Use similar geometry. Yeah, a few other things about this box. So it's made mostly of MDF. If you're going to make one of these, I suggest making it out of MDF. Don't use plywood. Plywood's stronger and it is lighter, but it's much harder to work with. When I made this one, I used plywood, and I had to use a significant amount of Bondo just to get rid of, like, you know, grain imperfections. And you know, when you're cutting all these grooves, because this was like, these grooves were cut with a router, you get a lot of tear out, or you hit a knot, or just there's a shitty spot in the plywood, and taking the time to fix all of those isn't worth it. Using MDF, you don't have any grain to worry about. It cuts nice and smooth. You just have to sand it a bit. It does make it heavier, but you know what, for something like this you're not going to move it often, so who cares. Another thing, if you're going to make something like this, I suggest you use a glossy paint for the black portions and for the tiles too, but for the black it actually makes a big difference. This one I originally painted with flat black for all the black parts, and it looked significantly worse. I repainted this one glossy black after I made this one, because this one just looks so much better with the glossy black, and it really does make it look more like a toy, just like a giant Rubik's Cube rather than, you know, a table shaped like a Rubik's Cube. It makes it more convincing. Also, if you're wondering about these tiles, these are just thin hardboard, which I just rounded over the edges and sanded them very well with fine sandpaper. I think I spray painted these ones. That's how you get such a nice finish. You can use, you can brush, or you can paint it with a brush. Painting with a brush is significantly easier, I find. If you're going to do it that way, you should thin the paint a bit first. I repainted a bunch of tiles on this one because I didn't like the way they looked, and I used enamel paint, but I thinned it, and that worked pretty well. If you don't thin it, you'll probably get brush marks, but if you thin it, it should come out okay. About as good as the spray paint does, and for significantly less effort. Spray painting these was a huge pain in the ass. It requires multiple coats, and you have to do it in a place where, you know, you have to have space to do it. And when you take all these and try to lay them all flat, because there's 6 sides to this, right? So if you try to lay all these flat and paint them, you need like a really big area, and it becomes really difficult and cumbersome to do. So painting by brush is a lot more convenient, at least. So I think I've covered everything on this table. If you have any questions about it, feel free to comment in the comment sections and I'll see if I can reply. And yeah, that's basically it.